Welcome to the Fragility Forum 2022 podcast series produced by the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group of the World Bank Group. As complexity and uncertainty become the new normal, with complex crises posing new challenges, from the COVID-19 pandemic to climate change, this podcast series explores how the international community can best support countries affected by fragility, conflict and violence in a fast-changing global landscape.
Hi, my name is Sarah Iman and I'm a partnership specialist at Unicef. In today's episode, we'll be speaking about compounding crises, how fragility and climate impact children's rights, with Gautam Narasimhan, Global Lead for Climate, Energy and Environment from Unicef, as well as Anna Arzayeva-Valenti, Global Lead for Conflict, Fragility, and Peacebuilding at Unicef. During our discussion, we're going to be examining the Children's Climate Risk Index, the first comprehensive view of children's vulnerability to climate change. We'll start with a brief overview of the index and how it relates to fragility, discuss some of the key findings in the report, as well as share some recommendations for addressing crises and challenges at the center of climate and fragility. Now with that, let's get started. So, Gautam, for those who may not be as familiar, can you maybe start by explaining what exactly the Children's Climate Risk Index is, and also perhaps how it's unique from other environmental or development indexes that are already in use?
Thanks so much, Sarah, and great to have the opportunity to be able to speak about this. Well, the Children's Climate Risk Index, or CCRI as we call it, is unique because it provides the first comprehensive view of children's exposure and vulnerability to the impacts of climate change from a child's perspective. I mean, we all generally accept that children and future generations will bear the brunt of the impacts of this planetary crisis that we're all in. But the CCRI tries to answer the question, where are children most vulnerable, and to which of these shocks? Because when we talk about climate shocks, we're talking about things like water scarcity, cyclone, vector-borne diseases, air pollution, which vary widely across the world. So the CCRI is the first attempt that tries to get our arms around where children are the most impacted and to which shocks they are. Well, and we created this index. You should remember that that these things aren't done in isolation. So UNICEF created this index in collaboration with several partners, including the Data for Children Collaborative and the Climate Cardinals, to serve as this is just an initial assessment of children's exposure and vulnerability to climate and environmental hazards. And we intended very much to help provide a tool to help decision makers prioritize climate action towards the children that are most at risk. And this index, the CCRI, it identifies which countries are at risk by bringing data together around two pillars. So in the first pillar, we have what is the exposure of children to climate and environmental hazards, shocks, or stresses. Again, things like water scarcity, cyclones, vector-borne diseases, air pollutions, which can vary widely across the geographic area. And secondly, the factors that drive child vulnerability and their coping capacity, such as things like the healthcare services, the ability of nutrition services, education services, to be able to help children cope with these shocks that they're facing. Because as we all know, having just purely a climate shock in one area can have very different impacts upon children depending on how well children are prepared and have the services to be able to deal with those shocks. So in the CCRI, we mentioned that there are a few different components, and overall, we've brought together data from around 57 indicators across these two pillars. And each of these indicators is composed of one or several components which are individual data sets. And that's the basis of this model. So there are 57 indicators, but if you look at it another way, there's a lot more data because several of these indicators are composite indicators. And we use these overall to measure a country's readiness and the capacities to be able to target the model towards more specific programmatic action. And bringing it back to the theme of this podcast, a key factor that is driving the underlying vulnerability of children is a country's fragility situation. And we've measured these using the OECD States of Fragility and the Informed Severity Index as well as some of those reference indicators. And Anna, putting it over to Anna because she's far better informed to speak more about the fragility. But really, coming back to the CCRI, looking at this, the fragility status of countries is so critical in the context of children's climate risks because children in fragile settings are so often less able to cope and respond to climate and environmental shocks.
Thank you, Gautam. Exactly. For children living in situations affected by fragility or protracted emergencies, climate change serves as a threat multiplier that adds another layer of complexity to their lives, very much exacerbating and disrupting their ability to thrive or even more bluntly to survive. We know actually that countries that are affected by fragility and conflict, as analyzed by the OECD states of fragility, are home to overwhelmingly young populations. And we also know that some of the greatest threats and deprivations to child rights are also concentrated in these settings. For example, compared to non-fragile contexts, children in extremely fragile contexts are more than 8 times as likely to lack basic drinking water and almost 4 times as likely to lack basic sanitation. These make children particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We know that society adaptive capacity depends on many factors, which also include degree of civil order, political transparency, and social cohesion. These factors, together with the poor quality and reach of child-centered services, conflicts that tend to weaken community resilience to external shocks and stresses, and also, frankly, gaps in capacities of systems and institutions to deliver shock-responsive services, all drive climate risk for children. Take an example of Chad. The Chari and Logone rivers, which flow into Lake Chad, provide the only source of natural irrigations. Livelihoods are dependent on subsistence farming and livestock rearing, so access to water is absolutely essential. A combination of droughts and over-irrigation during the past 50 years or so have caused 90% of Lake Chad to dry up. As the competition for access to Lake Chad and its resources has intensified, so have the tensions in the area, eroding social cohesion and resilience of communities and institutions. All of this causing immense impacts on children. So when we think about it this way, it is actually not surprising that 29 out of the 33 countries identified as extremely high risk in index were in fragile conflict or violence affected settings.
You know, that's why it's so great to have you both here today, because you each bring a unique perspective to the issues, right? Anya, your expertise in fragility, and Gautam, your expertise in climate. These are two fields that may not always overlap in development or humanitarian programming. But what I'm hearing from you both is that that's something that really needs to change because the two are interconnected, and addressing one will require actions to address the other. So Gautam, maybe if we could go back briefly to something you mentioned earlier. You said that the index assessed children's vulnerability to climate and environmental hazards and shocks. I'm curious to hear, what were some of the key findings that came out of your research?
Thanks, Sarah. Well, we found that approximately 1 billion children, and this is nearly half the world's children, live in extremely high-risk countries, and that over 1/3 of children globally are exposed to water scarcity. Over a third of children globally are exposed to lead pollution, for which there is no safe level and which has permanent neurological effects. 1 in 4 children are exposed to vector-borne diseases such as malaria and dengue, whose ranges will increase as a result of climate change, and other staggering figures. And critically, there are 850 million children that are facing at least 4 overlapping hazards, which are reinforcing one another. And these are the children that are particularly at risk. Crucially, these children that are most at risk are usually in countries that have the least per capita emissions to reduce. And as part of the CCRI, we did some modeling that concludes that the best way to reduce the climate risk for these children is to improve the climate resiliency of the services they depend upon, the essential services, water and sanitation, health, education. Yes, reducing global emissions is the only long-term solution to the climate crisis. But given climate dynamics and global warming, this will take time, and it's going to be too late for these children. The best way that we can reduce risk now for children that are the most vulnerable and for the generations after them is to focus on increasing adaptation and resilience capacity in those key services. Those are the best investments that we can make for these children.
And maybe, Sarah, if I could add to this, you know that families, once they're hit by crisis, they might be able to actually absorb the shock provided by the crisis if it's not too severe. However, when families or households are hit by multiple shocks consequently or simultaneously, their coping mechanisms and access to resources can be gradually restricted. Institutional policies and assistance can be exhausted too. So these cumulative and shocks and kind of complexities to situations which make them more dangerous. They also tend to exacerbate inequalities. Poorer children who already face economic disadvantages are further impacted with climate events, increase overall risk. They're less able to access key resources such as safe water, sanitation, food, health facilities, or education when crisis occurs, pushing them further into poverty. But in turn, we also know that grievances in communities around this inequitable access, around exclusion, and around marginalization, in turn, are some of the most persistent drivers of conflict. So it creates kind of a virtual, kind of a vicious cycle in a sense.
And yeah, and that's one of the key things that come out of the CCRI, as you mentioned, because this is also what this lays in stark contrast is that it's the poorer children who are affected most, and it's likely that their children become poorer still. And if we are really trying to work towards a world where there's a less chance of strife, less chance of global conflict, trying to reduce these inequality in terms of climate services that we provide is one of the best ways of being able to do so.
Yeah, and it is incredibly circular, these overlapping hazards and compounding crises. Hearing you both talk, it's difficult to know where to start when it comes to addressing the problem. There are so many competing priorities, and as you've just outlined, Gautam, the needs are great. 1 billion children are at an extremely high risk of the impacts of climate change. That is huge. You have a captive audience here that are all interested in finding solutions for these types of issues. So for the two of you, what kind of actions do you see as most impactful in breaking the cycle that you just described, Anna, of poverty and fragility? Where do we start?
Well, Sarah, yeah, I mean, the situation is grim, and at the same time, as someone I think was remarked to quote, despair is not a strategy. There are things that we know work. There are solutions that we know work. We know that in the near term, essential services for children will be paramount in the fight against climate change, particularly in the countries that will be affected the most. And what the CCRI tries to do is take an initial stab of trying to identify which services where will be of the most benefit. Because as we mentioned, even if global emissions stop today, global warming will continue to increase in the decades to come, and this will hurt the most vulnerable first and foremost. So again, while it's important that we don't take our eye off the ball in terms of reducing global emissions, we need an increased focus and attention on improving the resiliency of essential services. And this will be critical no matter what the future holds, and critical to ensure that we are serving the most vulnerable children, service of whom is our best chance also of being able to address issues such as conflict and fragility. Now, some of the key actions that you've been speaking about, this includes, first of all, of course, stepping up our investments and our service delivery in these key areas. But that isn't done in a vacuum. It is done also in the context of policies and programs that target and specifically improve access to safe water, sanitation, hygiene, education, healthcare, these essential services. Again, through the modeling that we've done, if you were to work specifically on making water and sanitation services more climate resilient, you would reduce the climate risk for 415 million children. If you were to increase investments in sustainable education, and remember, education has this huge multiplier effect. It empowers young people and teachers to find solutions to climate change, which in turn reduces the overall climate risk. If you were to do this, you would be able to reduce climate risk for 275 million children today. So there are things that we know that work.
Thank you, Gautam. I completely agree. We know that, as I said earlier, inequality and exclusion drives conflict. So these investments in inclusive and effective social services are absolutely essential. As we say in the UN, building systems whenever possible, providing effective humanitarian response whenever necessary, and prevention in all situations, which is consistent with the humanitarian development peace nexus approach. I'd also like to emphasize that one of the key things that we see is really effective on the ground is really taking a child and youth-centered approach, making sure we include children and young people at the very center of discussion and decision-making around climate change. For years, we know that young activists have been tackling the climate crisis, but they have not been heard until recently, right? Whether due to barriers that they face locally, right, to the situation to travel, for internet access, low media coverage, children and youth voices have been excluded, in particular those who are most vulnerable. And so that needs to change, right? So by listening and responding to the perspective of all children and young people on climate change, as well as peace and development issues, decision makers can in fact design better policies and related processes. Not doing so in turn actually undermines child right to be heard, as well as strength and power of climate action.
Absolutely, Anya. And there's some really great testimonies from children and young people throughout this index's report. Because as you said, once you accept that children are going to face the brunt of the impact of climate change, it is critical that we don't see them only as victims, but also the most critical clients for the solutions that we need to put in place. And there's some really good evidence out there that, as we know, the biggest brunt of climate change will fall upon children, particularly girls. And there's some really good evidence out there that when you involve girls and women in decision-making around environmental action and climate action, it leads to better outcomes. So the report speaks about that little thing. But if I could also highlight one more thing, the report is also while it's an attempt to present a unique and hopefully improved perspective on children's climate and environmental risks, it also is a call for more and better data. We really hope to continue to update and improve the index's model in the future to ensure that the resilience and capacity building is targeted for children in the most vulnerable contexts. And right now, our efforts are focused on expanding this index both subnationally to be able to refine the data to finer scales so we can really prioritize where inside a country children are the most vulnerable, as well as temporally. Children are being born every day, and our understanding of the future impacts of climate change are growing. So expanding the index to be not just about now, but where will the greatest future risk be?
I really love the way you both have laid that out, because it is easy to get a bit overwhelmed by the enormity of the problem, but what you're describing are really the short and medium-term actions that decision makers, policymakers, and practitioners can put in place now to address vulnerabilities and improve resiliency. It doesn't have to be this big approach that feels impossible. We have the tools now to start making a difference. We've spent a lot of time talking about the intersection of climate and fragility, but I'd like to really paint a picture of what this looks like for our audience. So maybe to wrap up, it'd be great if you could each share an example from your work and/or what UNICEF is doing at the country level to mitigate children's vulnerability to climate shocks and hazards, specifically in fragile settings.
Sure, Sarah, thank you. And certainly UNICEF is working with national, local, international partners across all these settings to drive the solutions. For example, this includes specific work on making child-centered services more inclusive, shock responses, and resilient, while at the same time making national and local risk management efforts more child-sensitive. So if you take the Sahel, right, following on that example, in the Sahel, communities have demonstrated extraordinary resilience so far. And what we need to do is to work together to help them do better. UNICEF is partnering with WFP, for example, and BMZ with Germany to implement an integrated multi-sectoral package of interventions across multiple countries in Sahel to foster resilience and social cohesion. So it's by an integrated package, I mean coming together really with health, with WASH, with education, with social protection, with child protection services, in an organized manner to the specific geographic areas. For doing this work, we have reached in 2012 at least 2 million vulnerable people and 1.7 million children in Mali, Mauritania, and in Niger with access to essential services that are not just delivered, but they are delivered through decentralized government services and communities, including during the times of shocks and stresses. So not just delivering the services, reducing vulnerability, but building those capacities for the longer term to better manage the future risks as they occur.
And just building on Anya's example, maybe just a moment to speak about the work that UNICEF and its partners are doing in Yemen. Well, even before the current conflict broke out, Yemen was one of the world's most water-scarce countries and is one of the countries where the CCRI points out children are the most vulnerable to climate change. And together with its partners, UNICEF has been scaling up its emergency water and sanitation assistance in all of Yemen to ensure sustainable services. And we do things like working with local wash authorities to help as part of training and capacity building in critically solarization of water systems and supporting rainwater harvesting, among many other projects to ensure that we are trying to do what we can for water and security in the country. And with the support of local authorities and resource partners, UNICEF has implemented the biggest solar-powered water pumping system in the entire country to ensure access to safe drinking water to the most vulnerable populations. The first two phases of this are helping to pump water distributed through a pipe network that was also commissioned, which brings safe and clean water to more than 55,000 people, which is about 70% of the total population of the city of Saada. And we're looking forward now to the next phase.
Two really impactful and innovative examples. Thank you both. And I think that brings us to the end of our segment. So thank you both for sharing your research and these critical findings with us today. We encourage all listeners to check out your report, The Climate Crisis is a Child's Rights Crisis, Introducing the Children's Climate Risk Index, as well as to share their reflections, feedback, or questions about this episode on social media. And be sure to use the official hashtag FragilityForum 2022.
This wraps up this episode of the podcast series. Thank you for listening, and please check out our other podcasts. For that, and to learn more about the World Bank Group efforts in environments affected by fragility, conflict, and violence, please visit our website www.worldbank.org/FCV.